Given that I'm about to talk about a sci-fi story, why am I done all up in a bit more of a fantasy look? Because I had a photo shoot earlier today, and I don't want to take all this off yet. I look good. I don't care that it's not thematic. Hello there, folks. We're going to talk today about Project Hail Mary, and we're going to talk about it as an adaptation. I have already done a review for the book. That is over on my secondary channel, Break Room of Geeks. So feel free to check that out if you want my thoughts on the book before I saw the movie. I have now actually seen the movie. I saw it on its opening weekend, which is unusual for me. Getting to movies that are in the theaters that quickly is difficult for mostly logistical reasons, but it's a very good movie. And I have been thinking about it a lot, specifically in terms of an adaptation, because my first impression upon exiting the theater was that that was really good. I liked the book better, though. Like, those thoughts really did come that quickly, one after the other. And a lot of it had to do with the changes that were made. However, the more I thought about those changes, the more that I found myself thinking is that, with very few exceptions, which I will address, the changes are pretty much all not only defensible, they're probably in the best interest of the movie. It is always fascinating to me the things that get adjusted, adapted, that might be disappointing for someone more familiar with the source material. But if you understand the shift that has to happen between mediums, you can recognize, oh, I get why, though. And that's what I want to talk about in this one, because I think this is a very well adapted movie. But first, we're actually going to talk about a sponsor. Yeah, I have one. It happens sometimes, not often, but sometimes. Today's video is sponsored by For Better or Worse, the speculative Star Trek The Next Generation scripts of L.J. Scott. If you go to ljscott.com, you can find these speculative scripts, these ideas written by someone who is very much a passionate fan of Star Trek The Next Generation, and it is all available for free. Yes, somebody paid me money to promote a free book. Hey, it is their money. They can do as they want. And I'm happy to throw that out there. So if you find science fiction in general, whether it be Project Hail Mary or Star Trek or anything else, to just be a fun thing to think about, and especially if you find the writing of it to be interesting, because that's what I'm going to be talking about today, I would say take a look at For Better or Worse to get a different perspective on the ways to write science fiction and stories and characters that you know taken in new directions. Thank you very much to LJ Scott for sponsoring this video. And now, let's talk about Project Hail Mary. There will, by necessity, be spoilers. I am going to move forward kind of assuming you have at least seen the movie and that you don't mind being told about stuff in the book that wasn't in the movie. That's my assumption. Or failing that, you just don't care. Maybe you just love hearing my voice and you don't really care what I talk about. And thank you. That's so flattering. That makes me feel good. But regardless, that is to let you know that if you have neither seen the movie nor read the book, I am going to spoil stuff. Though then again, if you saw all of the trailers in the lead up to the movie, you actually had most of it spoiled anyway. Not that the movie isn't still worth seeing if you did see all those trailers. I understood up to a point. I do think that they showed a little bit more than certainly I would have, but regardless. Project Hail Mary. The book is written by Andy Weir, previously best known for The Martian, also adapted into a very good movie. And both The Martian and Project Hail Mary had their scripts adapted by Drew Goddard. Different directors on each one, though. The Martian was done by Ridley Scott, while Project Hail Mary was helmed by Phil Lord and Christopher Miller. It stars Ryan Gosling as Ryland Grace, a molecular biologist turned middle school science teacher who finds himself recruited into a project to try and solve the problem of our sun starting to dim at a pace that is going to massively impact life on Earth and potentially, if they can't figure out what to do about it, wipe it out. I'm not going to go point for point through the plot, talking about, the cause of this thing, the solution of the thing. I want to talk a little bit more broad, though I will go into some specifics at various points. Boiling it down, our sun is not the only one that is affected. Nearly every sun in the local vicinity is actually starting to dim, except for one, and we don't know why. And so Ryland Grace is sent out on the Hail Mary in order to try and find out why that sun is unaffected. And hopefully what he learns there can be sent back to Earth in order to help solve the problem back home. Of course, while out and about trying to sort all this, Grace runs into an alien, a being by the name of Rocky. The two meet, learn to communicate, bond. It is a gorgeous relationship. And it is the emotional backbone of the story, both in written and film form. The movie is, in many ways, a very faithful adaptation. But the immediate thing that made me think, I like the book better, has to do with the amount of detail. Now, it's pretty typical that details are something that is going to be lost simply for lack of time to do them or lack of a clean way to convey the same thing. That's not always the case, but it's pretty typical that for the sake of brevity, to fit it into a movie runtime, characters will be condensed, a few plot points will be crushed down into a shorter time frame. Some things might be dropped that certainly were interesting but aren't necessarily plot essential, just to keep things moving forward. And all those sorts of things did happen in this, but it has an interesting effect because in an odd way, in the book, the details kind of are the plot. The book is entirely first-person narrated by Ryland Grace himself. His perspective is never left. Every piece of narration is his thought or his memory. The flashbacks are interestingly actually kind of diegetic because he wakes up on the Hail Mary not remembering very much, and as things come back, they are relayed to the reader at the same moment that he remembers it. That particular aspect is a little bit hazier, but it is effectively portrayed the same way in the movie. But because we hear Grace's entire thought process, we get to hear a lot of stuff that just doesn't translate to film, at least not in a way that works particularly well. All of the details and the nuts and bolts of how the various pieces of science work, the molecular science, the astrophysics, the engineering, all this other stuff. One of the things about Grace as a character is that he is probably science's biggest hype man ever. He loves science and he loves learning new stuff and he loves communicating that to his students. It's part of why he really adores the position he finds himself in after he left academia. All of that is conveyed so thoroughly through the thoughts that we get to hear.
I'm a single man in my 30s who lives alone in a small apartment. I don't have any kids, but I like kids a lot. I don't like where this is going. A teacher. I'm a school teacher. I remember it now. Oh, thank God.
But you can't really just have Grace saying those out loud. You can have voiceover, but that has a tendency to come across a bit clunky. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, but wasn't that also kind of true of The Martian? They just had him do a whole bunch of video blogs. Well, yeah, sort of, and there's a little bit of that here. However, they can't lean on it in quite the same way because The Martian did leave Mark Watney's perspective at various points throughout the story. Here, a whole ton of the story, a whole ton of what is going on in Grace's head and how we as the readers understand it when it's in the book, it is conveyed strictly through his thoughts that it doesn't make sense for him to say out loud, would come across as clunky if he said them out loud, even in a video blog. Because in a video blog or a video journal recording, whatever, he might summarize these things, but when you read the book, you're not getting summaries, you're getting his thoughts as they happen. So that would actually water it down arguably more. Instead, the movie opts to lean on Ryan Gosling as an actor to be able to convey the sense of thinking, like with a handful of lines here and there to keep the audience up on what it is he's thinking about, but he has to bring it across in the face, which means it has to be broader. You know, that sense of excitement, that sense of, oh, this, like we get that, but the very specific scientific details of what he's thinking, they have to remain in the book. Now, it is worth noting, it would be untrue to say that a lot of details simply don't exist in the movie. There is some work done to bring visual storytelling to the table as much as is possible. I'm going to make a little bit of what might be an odd comparison, and that is to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies. Now, J.R.R. Tolkien was also a very detail-oriented writer, but of course his details had a lot more to do with the folklore, the myths, the history, the cultures, and all this other stuff, which is difficult to convey in a movie. But what they did is that they conveyed it rather than through dialogue and characters expositing to each other about each new culture, race, whatever they run into, is to do it through visual storytellings and uniquely tailoring things like the clothes, the weapons, the architecture, and have that tell the narrative like this is a very distinct culture from this. The people of Rohan are so much different from the people of Gondor, are so much different from the elves in Rivendell. And we have all these visual signifiers that will convey a sense of the history that Tolkien got into in more detail through a strictly visual perspective. And there is a little of that here. Not quite to the same degree, but it is still here. I think the go-to example in this is that in the book, there's a bit of time spent establishing, the rapport between Grace and Rocky. And one of the initial things that Grace realizes is that Rocky's math, while it is true that all math is the same and operates on the same laws, Rocky's math is based on having a base 6 instead of a base 10, which makes total logical sense because we have base 10 in our math because we have 5 fingers on each hand, total of 10 fingers. Once we hit 10, it makes sense to roll over and we're into new digits. Rocky has 3 digits per hand. So between 2 hands being used primarily, for physical manipulation of stuff, he has 6 fingers. All his math is in base 6. Now, there is a nod to this within the movie because we do see a clock that Rocky uses and he shows to Grace, and there is distinctly 6 sides to the turning portion of the clock. It's still base 6 math. They didn't change that, but there isn't the same amount of attention drawn to it and the same amount of time spent talking about it because that's not the strength of film. I have talked in other videos before, and I went into this in greatest depth in the video that I made about Zack Snyder's Watchmen. But one of the really tricky things about adapting something is if that thing is taking advantage of something that is, if not unique, at least a strength of its original medium that either doesn't exist at all in other mediums or is really difficult to do to the same degree. The more you tailor something to the medium it is originally made in, the more difficult it is going to be to translate it to another medium and have it work. Project Hail Mary had that hurdle because we get the active thoughts of Grace. There are few things that can do hearing every thought and understanding every detail of a thought process and what is in a character's head. You'll be hard pressed to find a medium better at communicating that than prose, or at least more direct at communicating it than prose, because we can just hear a character's thoughts and it flows off the page just as well as a third-person narration does. It's all just words in the end, as long as they are well crafted. Whether we are hearing every thought or being told a description of what a character is doing, it all flows off the page equally as well, at least potentially, assuming it's well written. Interestingly, I've actually heard some people argue that the audiobook is the best way to experience the original work. Because in some ways the book is practically a stream of consciousness, the narration by Ray Porter does an excellent job of giving you the sense that these are the active thoughts as they happen. Now, I took in the original book as an audiobook, so while I can verify that the narration is fantastic, I can't absolutely confirm that it is better than the original work. However, I can say, having thought about it and hearing what people say, I am inclined to believe that. But that's a shift that works because audio is a medium that still expects all of the information to just be said. That's just not how film works, at least not at its best. So it was always the thing that was going to get most lost in the shift from a written or audio presentation to a visual one. When you get to film, getting every thought that's in a character's head, no. Again, it's not that you can't, there are tools you can use, but they really are ill fits for the medium of film, a visual storytelling medium. And thus, as I said, they have to lean on Ryan Gosling, communicating that sense with his face and his performance, but that can only ever give you the broad strokes. That can't give you all the specifics. And while, as a fan of the book, that can be a little bit disappointing and make it feel, oh, lesser feels mean, but make it feel like not quite the same experience, does it need to be the same experience? I mean, obviously it is intended to capture a similar feeling or at least get some of the core heart of the original work, but is a movie of a book supposed to give you the exact same experience of the book? This is something that I brought up before and why I think it's a very poor approach to adaptation in general, to just stick as close as possible to the original work. I'm like, okay, but what if what the original work is doing doesn't translate to your new medium very well? You're not doing the story any favors by doing that. Not to mention, if you're just recreating the original experience, people can just read the book. Watching the movie needs to not only carry over what was core to the book, it needs to also be its own thing. Otherwise, there's no purpose in experiencing both. You just pick your preferred medium and don't even bother with the other one because it's just the same thing in a different package. But if you properly lean into what your medium can do that maybe the original one can't, that's going to work well. And the expertly crafted visuals of Project Hail Mary do a lot. I mean, some things are very straightforward translations. Rocky looks basically exactly as I envisioned him.
Rocky, get tickets for all friends.
With what money?
Ryan Gosling money.
Wait.
But things like the planet Adrian and the Petrova line are visualized in ways that, if Andy Weir had tried to describe them in that level of detail, might have frankly become ponderous. But in just a flash of imagery, so much can be communicated to an audience and give a different, fresher, newer experience. And I do think that the movie manages to do that. There's a part of me that can be sad and bemoan the loss, or at least the de-emphasizing of so many of the additional characters. Some of my favorite characters are really only in a couple of scenes. My favorite side character is Dimitri, who, if he appears in the movie, he's just shown in groups with a bunch of other people working on the project. He doesn't get a highlight, and I love that crazy Russian. There are numerous characters who exist only for a couple of scenes within the book, but Andy Weir does a great job at communicating really quickly their personalities, and you get a really strong sense of them. And the movie could have done that. I don't think it would have been impossible to translate, but it chose to really truly focus down on the core cast: Grace, Rocky, and to a certain extent, Strat. Now, Strat does suffer, I think, as a character from the one specific detail that is not laid out that I do think actually does hurt the narrative slightly. Because a whole bunch of the details, as I said, are largely arguably present, just not laid out in as explicit detail, as cleanly to the audience as they are to the readers of the book. So, like, for example, the math that Grace writes on his little whiteboard or whatever is the accurate math. But when you read the book, that math is explained to you. Not just like, here's the formula, but like, okay, this means that, and this means that, and therefore this means that. The math is still there. You can see it. He's writing it out. But it's not going to be explained and detailed to the audience in the same way. And that is ultimately fine. Does it alter the experience? Yes. But you know what movies are really, really good at? Emotional connection, character banter. And not to say those things aren't good in the book, but between the chemistry of two performers, even when one of them is an animatronic rock, you can communicate more than you're gonna get just on the page or even from an audiobook. And there are some details that, like, I think are really cool in the book because it just shows the extent to which Andy Weir thought of so many things and like how many dominoes falling from the result of one thing, it results in this. And seeing that play out is really interesting in the book, but would have been ultimately kind of boring. So like in the movie, Grace finds his name pretty much immediately and has full run of the ship. In the book, the computer actually doesn't let him access major parts of the ship until he can answer some basic questions.
What's your name? Only now does it occur to me, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I do. I don't remember anything at all. I say. Incorrect.
And it's a safety feature because if he's come out of the coma and he's too wonky to even remember his name, then he shouldn't be trusted at the controls of anything in the ship. So he's blocked from access. That's a fantastic detail in the book because it shows the extent to which Andy Weir really thought about all the possibilities and contingencies and things to cover for. But it's a detail that makes sense to drop for the film because it's just going to stall for time in order to cover for an issue that most people aren't even going to realize. One of the aspects of a film is that it is temporally locked. You only experience it for as long as the filmmakers decided that it lasts, and you are constantly moving forward in it. When you take these diversions to detail how the Astrovage breeding farm was made, which was one of the things I thought was really neat and brought in some interesting characters, that is going to feel more like a distraction from the film because you are taking what is ultimately a limited amount of time that could be spent on your core cast and spending it on something that, while interesting, is a diversion. And it works on the page because reading is at a pace set by the reader. You can read something at a leisurely pace. You take as many sessions as you want. Even if you're listening to it on audiobook, hell, you can speed it up if you want it to go faster. You don't have that power going to the theater for a movie. And so you do have to be more considerate of people's time. And you do have to ultimately drop details that are very cool, but slow the pace. Pacing does matter in a book, but it is the lifeblood of a film, and prioritizing it is not a mistake. That having been said, I did mention that there is one specific detail that was dropped that I actually think does impact at least the character of Strat somewhat negatively. So this is like the big spoiler where even if you saw the trailers, you didn't have this bit spoiled for you. We find out, and Grace remembers and realizes towards the end, that he never actually volunteered. There were supposed to be other people being the science officer on that. There was a primary and there was a backup, and they both perished in an accident. And when that happened, he was the best candidate. And when he couldn't bring himself to go, he was too scared and he wouldn't agree to it, Strat put him in a coma forcibly and sent him anyways. That happens in both the book and the movie. But in the book, there's an additional reason beyond they have very little time left and she doesn't think they can train somebody else and get somebody else up to speed and have the knowledge that they need. There's another major factor. The coma that he and the other two crew members who actually die en route, but the coma that they are placed in is fatal to most people, being put under for that long. But it had been discovered in the book that there is a gene that about 1 in 7,000 people have that will allow them to be in a coma for that extended period of time, come out of it, and their brain won't be mush. And Grace has that gene. And that factor makes Strat's decision to forcibly send him on this mission a lot more understandable. Understand, it's still not necessarily painted as a good thing. It is painted as a kind of ruthless thing. And Strat, I think, is a fascinating character, but she comes across as meaner in the movie because you can't help but wonder, okay, yeah, maybe he's the best, but is there really nobody else? Is there not somebody who wants this, who has most of the knowledge and like maybe can be brought up to speed on other stuff? Yeah, you've only got a few days, but really there's nobody else? In the book, it is explicit. Yeah, there really isn't. Like the next viable candidate, if they don't send Grace, who has any scientific background, who has the gene and who volunteered, was somebody who, if I remember correctly, was just a chemist at a pharmacy and just had an undergraduate degree. and none of the specific knowledge that was needed to help solve this problem. So it truly was a matter of, if they didn't send Grace by force, the next best option was so useless that they might as well not bother. But that isn't established in the movie. And as a result, it does make Strat an even colder and more, as I said, ruthless character than she is in the book. And she is that in the book. She is a glorious pragmatist. I adore her in the book. And I also really like the perspective that she has, because there's a point where Grace asks her, what do you think you'll do at the other side of this once the launch happens and all there is, for Earth to do is wait for the information to be sent back. She says very flatly, "Oh, I'll probably be dragged into multiple international courts to answer for everything that I have done in trying to pull this together." She knew that she was going to step on so many toes and break so many laws and get so many people rightfully angry at her, but she was doing it with an eye towards saving the species. But she also doesn't use that as an excuse to not ultimately face the consequences of what she's doing. She knows she'll face them. She thinks she was right to do it, but she also doesn't use that as an excuse to dodge responsibility. I love her as a character, and she is, unfortunately, because of that one decision, slightly off. That is one of the few cases in the movie where I do think removing one of the details kind of hurts things a little bit. But they didn't just take stuff away. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I said is hinted at, is probably technically still there. It just doesn't get highlighted or detailed. There's like a really quick acknowledgement of the original two science officers who were, one of them was supposed to go, that they are having a sexual affair. That is hinted at. That's actually a very funny portion of the book when that comes up, but it just gets a little acknowledgement. So all of it's technically still true, just not getting a focus. But there's one major addition, and it was a perfect addition for the film specifically. Because in the book, Grace never gets to go onto Rocky's ship for purely logistical reasons. It's too hot. There is a little bit of an acknowledgement that Rocky's environment is hotter than Grace's, but like just how much hotter doesn't really come up to the extent that it actually is really important in the book. It impacts a lot of stuff, including the fact that Grace gets very badly burned in his effort to get Rocky back into his own environment after Rocky saves him from extreme gravitational forces. And the movie kind of skipped that, which in and of itself is okay. There is going to be a later opportunity for Grace to also save Rocky in return, so they do still ultimately save each other, even if that specific beat is missed. Although there is a quick moment where there's like a highlight of a burn on Grace's arm, and I found myself going, did I miss something? They didn't do that part. When did he get burned? I don't know. Maybe that was like a little acknowledgement of a bit they didn't do. But regardless, what they added, as I said, is Grace going onto Rocky's ship. And he couldn't in the book because it was way too hot and they didn't have the time to figure out how they could get him on there. But they did for this. Rocky makes him a suit so that he can see Rocky's ship. Something that book Grace really wanted to do but couldn't and was a little bummed about. But ultimately, what would it have been for him to do that? It would have been, some descriptions, and it would have been interesting, but most of the properties of the ship were things that he already knew. He knew how the xenonite worked. He knew why they could design a ship that, from our perspective, is not aerodynamic at all. How'd that ever break atmosphere? Well, because it's made of way better material than we have access to. But what would he learn going inside? Like, he knows they use astrophage as fuel, same as he does, probably in a slightly different way, but would there be that much to describe in the book? Some, but not a ton. The movie, when you can visualize and take full advantage of the visual medium to show not only the interior of Rocky's ship, but to show the joy on Grace's face at getting to see this and just let it be Zero talking. Because that's the other thing. If you did it in the book, you'd be hearing Grace's inner monologue of like, wow, this is amazing. This is great. And again, that works for the book. But a moment like that And similarly, some of the moments with him looking at the planet Adrian and when they're in the Petrova line, some of the great, really notable visuals of the movie, this is up there as well. And it's a moment unique to the movie because the movie can just do the visuals better. And there's no dialogue in that moment. It is all the things that the film can do that the book can't, with no words and only images and music. And speaking of music, another addition was when Strat sang karaoke. That's a moment original to the movie that it never would have worked in the book because having a character sing plays exactly the same as having them talk when it's on the page. So that's another instance of an addition specifically for the medium. And to throw out one more addition that the movies did, that room that's nothing but the screens that allows Grace to sort of see Earth environments again, that's not in the book. Of course it's not. Space on the Hail Mary was at a premium. They wouldn't sacrifice space for that thing that has no practical use. But it's a great visual and I think a solid addition when you are doing a version of the story that's not as focused on the kind of details where you would realize they would never put this here. So is it a perfect adaptation? No, I have a couple of notes, but it is an incredibly well thought out adaptation. The things that were left out, as I say, they do alter the experience because the book is so detail oriented. It does alter the experience to not have that same level of detail, but that same level of detail wouldn't work on film. It just wouldn't. Not in the way that it did in the book. And so they shift and they lean into things that they can do. Not at the sacrifice of the core of the book, but just in a shifting of the priorities. It's the reason a lot of these side characters on Earth are ultimately cut. As much as I might like them, they are a distraction from what the film can do really, really well. And this is the kind of adaptation that I adore. When something recognizes the strengths that the new medium that you're adapting into has that the original version didn't, and what can we do with that? And this movie really does a fantastic job with it. I do still personally have my preference for the book, but I cannot deny that if you're going to adapt a book like that, far more important than capturing every detail and communicating it in the same way is doing what they actually did. Finding a way to visualize it, present it in a way that isn't just nonstop talking, so it starts to feel like you're watching a video lecture. Lean into what you can do to take this story and, yes, change it a bit. You have to. Because if you don't, you're just going to end up with the same thing but worse. It's not the same thing but worse. It's its own thing. Spawned from the same core concepts, the same characters, many of the same moments. But it is ultimately its own thing, which is what makes it a great adaptation and a great movie. And I hope folks are really, really enjoying it, because I know I did. If you have seen the movie but haven't read the book, I highly recommend it. That's actually generally my recommendation in general when it comes to the whole, oh, you should read the book before seeing the movie. I am 100% the opposite direction. I think generally it is almost always better to see the movie before reading the book. Because while, yes, it'll impact some things about your reading of the book, like you'll probably end up hearing the actors' voices and picturing them. But like as far as the scope of the experience, reading the book's like getting the extended edition because almost invariably stuff was cut, characters were condensed, scenes were removed. You're going to get the same thing but more. Whereas even in a great movie, even in a great adaptation, if you've read the book, especially if you've read the book recently, if you're anything like me, at least, a part of your brain's going to be cataloging what was different. And it could be things as grand as seeing the interior of Rocky's ship, or as small and odd as the fact that they made Rocky feel completely different about the way he ate. It was something that embarrassed him in the book, but he was like oddly proud of it in the movie.
How do you look when you eat?
It looked beautiful.
Doesn't matter. It was a funny moment. Funny moment in both cases, actually. But in any case, have you seen the movie? Have you read the book? What are your thoughts on any of this? Do you think it was well adapted? I think it was extremely well adapted. Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. Thank you to LJ Scott for sponsoring this video. You can check out perks over there if you want to help keep this whole thing going. Like, share, subscribe also help. Don't worry too much about that, though. what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Jared Boyce, Zubin Lafula, Auntie Kate 808, Mira G, Angry Casperol, Dave Hall, Oliver B, Mystic Shadow, Sean Miller, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Melissa Pedersen, Becky Sparks, Ulrich, Twilord, Tracy Scrabbit, Pau Barabajoggle, Sir Didymus is my favorite, and to thank some folks from the lower tiers: Cyborg Ex Machina, Alex, and Lightning Spirit. You know, I've been saying Angry Casperol for ages, and I almost said Angie Casperol. You are distracting, the whole lot of you.